So yeah, we're going to talk about SBOMs. My name is Dunbar-Hall. I lead the open source program office at Lockheed Martin. I also do a lot in, I'll say, the OpenSSF, more on the SBOM security tooling working group side. And really happy to hear to talk. Let's turn it over to Mark to introduce himself.
Like a skit that we're doing here.
Yeah, that's right.
Dance and stuff. So I'm Mark. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Manifest. We are focused on the question of SBOM and more recently AI bomb generation consumption. Really excited to be speaking with you all today, not least because Ian and I are acutely aware that we are the only things keeping you from the happy hour afterwards. So we'll try to make it brief. The idea here today is that we'll talk about the urgency of SBOM. You know, I think when we talk about SBOMs, we operate on this like fundamental assumption, you know, that everybody's tracking all of the various executive orders and regulatory mandates and what have you. We'll talk about what good looks like from an end-to-end SBOM flow. Some of this will be new to you, some of it will not. I'll turn it over to Ian, and we'll talk about, you know, where all of these various OpenSSF projects plug in, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussions, questions, and tomato throwing at the end. Cool. So why are we here? Why did I fly from Connecticut 2,300 miles and left my 7-year-old who just tried out for travel baseball to talk to you about software bills and materials? And the reason why we're here is because software remains the only thing on planet Earth that we buy that you don't get to know what's in it. And here we are 3 years on from the Log4 Shell debacle, and this is still by and large a fundamental truth. Ian and I were commiserating over outstanding Mexican food earlier today. And it's still true. Even an organization like Lockheed Martin, an organization like the US Army, an organization like the Mayo Clinic, they don't get to know what's in their software components. And that's fundamentally broken, and it's broken for a number of reasons. One of which is that 80% of applications contain at least one security vulnerability, and we can quibble over how important or not important that vulnerability is. 72% of our nearest and dearest colleagues point out a lack of visibility in their software supply chains as the biggest, most existential risk that they face today. 60% of organizations plan to require SBOMs from their third parties by 2026, although I have a firmly held belief that whenever anybody says, 24 months down the line, they mean some uncertain date in the future that I don't have any more fidelity in. And then finally, if you were to go through every one of the open source projects, this was at least true in 2023, only 11% of them are actively maintained. So we have a mountain of supply chain, the most valuable supply chain that mankind has ever created, on a molehill of support. This is a problem, and it's a problem not just for me and Ian and others in this community. This is a problem that regulators, legislators, professionals, colleagues of ours have identified. And so, as I'm very fond of saying, you know, I went to school and I got a degree in security. I should have gone to school. I should have gone to law school. There is a litany of SBOM regulatory requirements. And frankly, thank goodness there is, right? If I personally have learned anything from being on this SBOM journey over the last couple of years, it's that people are busy. And if it's not a thou must or thou shalt, it becomes a boy howdy, I hope we get to that in Q3 of 2020 never. And so you've got this growing corpus of regulatory requirements here in the United States. You've got Executive Order 14028. You've got proposed FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation reforms. You've got the National Cybersecurity Strategy of March of 2023. You've got Section 524B of the FD&C Act from the FDA. But we're not, as much as most Americans probably believe that we are, we're not the only people on planet Earth. And so SBOMs have taken off elsewhere around the world as well. You've got a joint statement from the Quad countries. This is India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, talking about the importance of SBOM from last year. You've got NIS2. You've got the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe, which is going to set requirements that thou must, thou shalt, generate SBOMs for the applications that you build if you sell software in the EU. And if you don't, they will fine you 15 million euros, or 2.5% of annual throughput, whichever is greater. And if you think they're kidding, I have something called GDPR to point you towards. So what does SBOM look like? What does good look like? And so we shamelessly stole this from the SALSA framework. You've got on my right, your left-hand side here, the SBOM producer, requiring SBOMs from your third parties. If question 1B in your OneTrust or WSTIC or RSA Archer questionnaire is not upload your SBOM in CycloneDX or SPDX here, that will eventually change. And so when you get those SBOMs, you put them in a repository. And when you put them in the repository, they ought to live alongside the SBOMs that you are generating from your internal applications, irrespective of, we could have a very long debate over, are you generating them at source, are you generating them build time, at runtime, et cetera. There's a very long tail of technical nuances here, but the fact of the matter is your third-party SBOMs and your internal SBOMs ought to end up in that same repository where those dependencies are scanned for risk and vulnerabilities and then ultimately pushed out to the SBOM consumer, whether your SBOM consumer is Army Acquisition Logistics and Technology, the Air Force's Kessel Run, the Mayo Clinic, Goldman Sachs, whoever. This is the crawl phase. As crazy as that sounds, this is the very, very beginning of what a good SBOM program looks like. This also opens a can of worms. You all around this table, proverbial conference room, et cetera, have been around long enough to know this opens up more questions than it solves. It opens up questions like, where does SBOM signing and attestation fit into this? How do we account for the pedigree of an SBOM? How do I know that this JSON file that I shamelessly took from my vendor came from that vendor? How do I know that it didn't get tampered with, that they didn't just scrub out all the bad stuff that they didn't want us to know about? How do we ensure the immutable nature of an SBOM, the tamper-proof nature of an SBOM? And who is liable if an SBOM is modified? And this is what I mean by saying I should have gone to law school. I have two pieces of news for you about requiring SBOMs, and they are in direct conflict with each other. One is that asking for an SBOM is harder than you think. If you're at any measure, any semblance of a large organization, you have to go talk to these people. Now, I don't know about it, your organization, most of the time these people, their top priority is not knowing the ins and outs of SPDX versus CycloneDX JSON. The business side doesn't care. They don't know what an SBOM is. They don't know. Their primary concern is who's going to be responsible for owning this? How long is this going to delay my procurement of a new tool? And how much is this going to cost? The security team is going to say, well, what format do we need this as? CycloneDX? What? Come on. What do we do with the broken SBOMs? What do we do with the SBOMs that don't have supplier information, that don't have version information, that don't have provenance? How are we going to contextualize these vulnerabilities on top of the 1,700 angry red triangles that I had on my desk when I woke up this morning? The legal team is going to say, how do we incorporate this into our agreements? What's the magic words that I'm supposed to put into an MSA to require a well-formatted SBOM? And it's not as easy as just saying, oh, give me like the NTIA minimum elements for a whole host of reasons. And then what are we supposed to do with our existing vendors? What about the guy who sold me something 23 months ago, who's already been paid, who's already delivered, who's coming up for renewal, who has absolutely no interest in going back and figuring out some additional compliance requirement that nobody had heard of back in 2021? And then finally, procurement is going to say, we already have our 200-page vendor due diligence questionnaire. We already have our process. You're adding more work. You're adding more layers. How are we supposed to play amateur AppSec to the 5,000 vendors that we buy software from? So asking for an SBOM is harder than you think. The good news is asking for an SBOM is also easier than you think. There is, over the course of the last 6 to 12 months, and shameless plug for me and my brilliance, there are a growing corpus of resources at your disposal. How to talk to your procurement teams, how to talk to your legal teams, what is the MSA language that you're supposed to use that comes from the Edison Electric Institute? How do you Mad Libs the email outreach to your vendors so that you are not only explaining to them what an SBOM is and what format that you need it in, but you're also Mad Libbing what happens when they tell you, my legal counsel tells me this is my secret sauce and I can't give it to you. It's on our roadmap for Q3 of next year. We only do SPDX and you're asking for it in CycloneDX. You're not going to know what to do with it. We have a whole bunch of explanations for all of the bad stuff that you're about to find. How do you put all of those conversations on rails? And then separately, how do you automate the process of cutting down on that transaction back and forth from asking for the SBOM to receiving the SBOM, to ingesting the SBOM, to analyzing the SBOM, to alerting on the SBOM, to snoozing the vulnerabilities that you find in the SBOM, to adjudicating those and creating a VEX document? There is much more tooling than there has ever been previously to accommodate these workflows in an automated fashion so that you're not hospital passing your procurement, your legal, your compliance teams with a whole raft of extra stuff that they didn't wake up this morning wanting to do. So that's at a very high theoretical level. The last thing that I'll leave you with is, when I started on this journey, it was really just, it was There were various industry regulations for the automotive industry. They have UNECE R155, cybersecurity of wheeled vehicle requirements. And then there was Executive Order 14028 for defense contractors. And then there was Section 524B for medical device manufacturers. And now there's the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe, and there's draft legislation in China and in Japan. The SBOM snowplow is coming for us all. There's been a lot of ink spilled over, does SBOM have analytic value? Does SBOM have third-party risk value? Should SBOMs be generated at build time and runtime and what have you? The number one thing that I can say is that irrespective of whether you're an auto manufacturer, irrespective of whether you're a defense contractor, irrespective of whether you're a medical device manufacturer, irrespective of whether you sell to Europe, somebody is coming for you for SBOM requirements, and that day will probably be here sooner than you think. So I want to end my bit on a positive note, which is there are people in this community who are doing this really, really well, and I'm going to make Ian blush here for a moment. Ian has, to his eternal credit, stitched together an unbelievable amount of tooling and expertise on his team and elsewhere for how to do this, in no small part with OpenSSF projects. And so I'll turn it over to Ian, and I'll let him tell you a little bit about how he's doing it. Ian?
I'm just rosy with, compliments. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit more on the OpenSSF side, right? We talk a lot about this process by which we get SBOMs. Who here is receiving SBOMs from their vendors? Oh, that makes me sad. So as someone who does work for a large enterprise, when I request SBOMs, I often do get them via email, and a lot of times they're PDFs, and sometimes they're like purchase agreements and other things that would not be relevant in this discussion, right? So there's a lot to be said about what that looks like today, which clearly there's room for improvement. But I'm going to really frame like that next step, right? Like once everyone is delivering things in a format that we can read machine readably, right? What do we want to do there? And that's really, I think, where the security tooling working group within OpenSSF is like really shining today. So I'm going to make Porco blush because he's right there. I think you'll look on the logos here, right? Like two of these are really much babies of his, and I think that's really been the foundation for where we're going. So I'll look to Protobomb first, right? I think it's an amazing project that's really helped maybe heal the SBOM community a little bit and try to unify how we interact with them, right? On one side, you'll see a specification, SBOMit, which is kind of trying to say, like, how do we make something verifiable? How do we ensure the integrity of an SBOM? How do we make sure it represents what it actually is? And then on the far side, Bomctl is trying to answer that question of, like, how do we move things without emails, right? Like, how do we look at a system that can be complex and parse it down where we have container images with SBOMs and OCI? We may have binaries and their SBOMs located as GitHub releases. How do we tie all that together to have like a unified, like hierarchical SBOM structure? And lastly, I got to throw OpenVex in there, right? For a lot of us, we know that vulnerability information should be entirely separate than the content of your SBOM, but there's very much a discussion that I see regularly. I just saw someone ask this question within OpenSSF, I want to say earlier this week, trying to get confirmation of that. So I think the key problems that each of these are solving, I kind of said it, but I'll say it again, right? Protobomb, everyone's pretty familiar with it, is really working across SBOM formats with a single library. Today, Go. I think there's a room there based on protobufs to have other language libraries for it. But as someone who's a consumer of it, it's really been a great way for us to build additional tooling. And that's where the next two fall on. So I'll say in SBOMit as a specification is trying to make SBOMs verifiable. How do we marry in-Toto attestations? Could be Salsa, it could be others. And bring them into an SBOM so that the SBOM actually can be verified as to the components are what they say they are. You can answer questions about tests and whatnot. And lastly, Bomctl is really focusing on marrying the difference between, I'll say, SBOM generation and maybe SBOM analysis. Like, how do we build more complex representations of systems? So SBOMit, I see Justin in the background here. He's a good person to ask if you have extra questions. And it's not the others right behind him. So you got SBOM, I should say, in-Toto royalty over there. But the idea being, right, is can we build upon the existing SBOM structure to bring in that in-Toto information, right? So how do we show that we have a lot of the stuff that you would expect from Salsa and other things directly within the SBOM document itself. And there's some advantages to that, right? It makes it easier to move documents across air-gapped networks, specifically in my use case, working for a defense contractor, right? And it allows me to use my existing tooling, right? So a lot of companies are going to spin up SBOM registries. They're going to spin up these other systems. How do we build on the existing tooling and not need to bring in a whole bunch of additional stuff, right? There's a lot of infrastructure there that has to go along with these other types of, I'll say, attestations. I wouldn't be, you got to throw a threat model in here, again, based on Salsa. I think a lot of those same threats apply here to SBOMs, right? We have unauthorized producers who may be producing SBOMs and releasing them, right? A key part of like what's outlined in Salsa. You may have compromised dependencies. You might have compromised build environments. How do we begin to look at that and capture that information, be it with Salsa or other types of in-Toto attestations? And then lastly, you have like build threats. Sure, you can't always detect a compromised build environment, but you have the attestations that would help you have the traceability there. And then how do you track, uploaded, modified SBOMs, and maybe if someone is compromised, like an SBOM registry. Again, this is directly from Salsa. I think you've all seen this and probably gone blurry-eyed at some point. But I think it's very much representative of any sort of attestation or anything that's going through some sort of CI/CD process. SBOMit helps in a lot of these areas, right? And this is, I think, a good table that represents maybe some of the distinctions here. So raw SBOMs, I'd love to get to that point. We're not there yet. But I think it shows, again, from that threat model, kind of where the flaws are. Same thing with signed SBOMs. Sigstore, excellent. Great step in that direction and really helping us solve the question around forgeries. And then what we are working on today with SBOMit, which is like phase 1, is how do we detect compromised repositories? How do we allow someone to detect failing tests, all that stuff, the stuff that in-Toto does effectively, right? How do we bring some of that in to the SBOM itself? And then lastly, phase 2, which is a little bit farther out, is really focused on that missing information. How do we ensure that you have a list of components, and we can verify those components in phase 1. How do we know that things aren't missing in phase 2? And there's some extra steps that are going to have to happen, probably some additional predicate types to make that happen. Bomctl. I've talked a lot about this project, and I get a lot of questions like, how is this different than Guac? Is a big one. Yeah, Mike's over there laughing. And I think the fundamental difference is Bomctl is trying to solve a problem around complexity where you're working locally on a set of SBOMs, right? So I'll talk a lot about SBOM trees or hierarchy of bombs. So easy example, you have a Helm chart. Helm chart includes container images. Those container images may include binaries. Well, to me, that's not one big SBOM. That really is a tree structure. And different people may be releasing different artifacts for different parts of that. So with Docker Hub coming along and releasing official SBOMs, I should be referencing that specific SBOM for that base image if I'm using it. Someone else may be releasing the binary that I'm putting inside that container image. I should expect that to be released by that party, right? I'm building a tree structure, and I'm just kind of bringing that data together. Bomctl is really focused on that idea of like multiple documents and using external references to build a tree structure that can be moved and manipulated, right? These SBOMs are gonna reside in different locations. They're gonna be released by different people, right? How do we take some of the principles of Sigstore and streamline the user experience to verify all the signatures on all these different SBOMs that could be coming from different places? How do we build the mechanisms in place to pull from all these different places? And then lastly, how do you maybe grab all the stuff, move it to a new place, maybe push it all to Guac for analysis. Maybe you're gonna push it to your internal SBOM registry. How do we do that, right? And I can say for me, looking at, I'll say vehicles, flight vehicles, space vehicles, big ground vehicles, right? An F-35 is not a giant 35 gigabyte SBOM, right? It's a plane that has tens of thousands of individual SBOMs potentially inside of it. How do we manage that structure and manipulate it, sign it, verify all of that is really where we're trying to go. And I think it's a really good tie-in with stuff that we're doing with Protobomb right? Because you can allow a tree structure to have cyclone-dx and SPDX documents residing in the same tree, right? You can move it. You could potentially output it in the format that you need for your processing. We kind of allow people to produce SBOMs in the format that they choose, and for you to work with them in the format that you choose. The idea of, allowing you to really work with whatever works best for you. So I kind of outlined some of those examples, but ultimately it's a CLI, it's simple, it's intended to be pipe friendly. So if you have other tools that you want to pipe things through, you can. We really wanted to focus on existing work. So today we're focused very heavily into protobomb integration. Sigstore is kind of next on the list to really facilitate that signing and verification step. And then I think as the SBOMit spec matures, we'll incorporate that. And lastly, again, it's that facilitation of movement of complex systems. How do we collect the documents, move them around, manipulate that tree structure? Because ultimately, as a lot of this kind of is implied, we talk a lot about the pedigree. And today, when we talk about SBOM pedigree, people are changing SBOMs at every step of that build process, right? And how do you show that pedigree today? No one is doing it, right? People are not necessarily respecting the original document. And if they do modify them, there aren't, I'll say attestations, but they're not in-Toto attestations that help show you the from to the to and what was done in between. How do we kind of build that into our tooling? I recommend you try out Bomctl. Here's the playground link. So we have a little Gitpod environment where you're in some instructions and kind of like walk you through it. And then lastly, I'm talking to a lot of people already involved in OpenSSF, so I don't have to shout it too loudly. But check out the different community meetings that are out there, and they're all on a community calendar and lots of active Slack conversation. And now I think this is the tomato throwing part. So, yeah, I think that is SBOMit in a nutshell of what it's really trying to achieve, right? So SBOMit as a specification is trying to help you verify that the contents match what was done as part of that build process. So taking in-Toto attestations and marrying them with an SBOM format so that there's this trust there, right? You can actually verify that there's evidence along the way for it. I know lots of people who are doing like decomposition right now of binaries to try to reverse engineer it, to try to do that proof. And that seems awfully labor intensive.
So hypothetically speaking, because nobody would ever ship software with vulnerabilities, at least in our experience right now, like that's good enough. That's Harvard meets Top Gun meets Navy SEALs. If you can provide me an SBOM, and then you can provide me with a VEX statement for each of the vulnerabilities in that SBOM, you're playing three-dimensional chess, and everybody else is playing checkers. I think it's probably useful to contextualize for the group when a large enterprise asks for an SBOM, everyone in this group assumes that they're getting back a properly formatted piece of JSON in CycloneDX or SPDX format. Oftentimes what they're actually getting back, and I can speak to this from personal experience, is a 29-page marketing PDF about the security that the medical device manufacturer endeavors to subscribe to, with a table on page 18 of the names of their open source dependencies, but no version information. And that's what they're counting as an SBOM. So if you're handing over a CycloneDX SBOM and you're handing over an OpenVex VEX statement, and you're saying, hey, does this get me, past the vendor due diligence ferry for right now? 100%.
So I'm curious what your thoughts might be about this. I've heard a lot about SBOMs as a compliance requirement. Basically, someone's going to come and they're going to ask you for this, so get ready, because you're going to have to handle one. And to me, that kind of misses the spirit of the law, if you will. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how we begin to make SBOMs into the basis for some genuine security programs. Because to me, that's why we're doing this. It's not so that I can check a box or give it to an auditor. It's so that it can become a tool. Therefore, the problem of the PDF and the giant list that's basically meaningless starts to take care of itself because it cannot serve that basic purpose. So I want to know your thoughts there.
Yeah, so I'll say it's more like an internal use case. So I'll look over to some of my other colleagues over here who've worked on this. So I think a good example of that is internally we use SBOMs clearly for legal compliance. and then for vulnerability. But a big use case for us is actually packaging. So we use SBOMs as the definition of what to package to bring into like an isolated environment. So like low side to high side, unclassified to classified. And so for us, as part of that process, we generate all the secure hashes, we validate signatures on the low side, and use it as like really more as like we verify that this matches the integrity, not just something that is produced after the fact. We use SBOMs as a source of truth on what to move between networks. So I don't know if that answers your question, but for us, it's much more than, I'll say, just that compliance activity. It's something that we've ingrained into our process as the source of how we generate compliance. Sure, I'm happy to talk afterwards, but I definitely, there's another project that we've open sourced called Hopper that does a lot of that. And we built it more into, I'll say, like a compliance pipeline, where it's a pluggable Python application where you can add in your own levels of compliance. And for us specifically, it goes to like government authorizing officials. Like how do we automate continuous delivery across the air-gapped networks?
You only get one.
Just one comment to how do we do something besides check a compliance box with SBOMs? I'll just say to connect you guys, like my team, we spend a very large amount of time lately, like trying to make sure that we can produce SBOMs at scale and that they're accurate. And then the next day, you get a support case from a customer who says, I scanned your thing with twist lock and it gave me this result. And it makes my team really sad to spend hundreds of hours compiling these super detailed, extremely accurate SBOMs, and then somebody goes and tries to use a tool which then reverse engineers the contents of it incorrectly. You know, not to like point out twist lock, but the problem is like, as long as if we have these SBOMs and we say they're correct, then why do we use tools to detect security vulnerabilities which do not use the SBOMs?
So I'll jump in there. I think there's an activity that's launching later on this month at MITRE. They have their Plug Fest. I would check that out, because I think in that case what they're doing is MITRE is requesting SBOMs from any vendors who want to participate, and they'll begin to compare them, right? And I think there's activity, especially like in the CISA SBOM community group, that's trying to resolve some of those discrepancies. I totally agree with you, though. It's a huge problem right now.
And I think just to marry these two comments together, you know, we're generating these things not as a compliance checkbox, but as a like living, breathing security application. When we see SBOMs from a third-party risk management perspective, it's often the only artifact that a TPRM, GRC, CSCRM person has that is persistently monitorable. If you think about all the other tools in their tool chest, you know, the 200-page OneTrust questionnaire, it's filled with qualitative questions like, do you do background checks on your developers? And do you have a disaster recovery site 90 miles away from your prod instance? Like, none of that is trackable, monitorable, scannable, quantifiable in any respect. And so, yes, like SBOM begins as a compliance artifact. You roll your eyes and you say, I have to hand over this thing that I worked really hard generating. But for an SBOM consumption program done well, it's the only quantitative scientific tool that they have in their toolkit.
For a question, maybe building on this a little bit and tying this back to Sigstore and signing in general, I'm definitely not an expert in these government mandates, but from what I understand, there's no requirement for integrity or authenticity for any of this metadata. Obviously, some of the projects you've discussed today are trying to close that gap, but what can we be doing more on the regulatory side so we start seeing these things become trusted artifacts that then can be used as part of a security pipeline?
So I'll defer to you for regulatory, but I will point out some activity that's happening. I see like Kari here, and there's Dan in the back here. I think, so within the public sector, there's a CNCF user group that's working on a white paper that kind of mirrors some of the other white papers that are coming out right now, but it's specifically targeting guidance and recommendations to, I'll say, public sector companies, but also to the government. So things like, hey, there should really be a government with government-backed authentication and identification Sigstore instance. So then folks like us who are trying to sign things with Sigstore and deliver them to the federal government have a trusted Sigstore instance that doesn't put that pressure on, I'll say, the public good instance. Same way we probably don't want some of our attestations and other signatures ending up by accident on the public Sigstore. Yeah, I don't necessarily want to inflict data spills on anyone who's supporting that. So I think there's some activities like that that we're working through specifically to have like guidance and recommendations that we hope specifically through the CNCF push towards that direction more as action, maybe not as regulatory. I don't know if you have anything on the regulatory front.
Yeah, I have some really bad news for you on the regulatory front, and the choices are bad and worse. For any of you who haven't been following kind of like the SBOM regulatory side, and Ian and I were talking about this over chips and salsa, so many of these regulatory frameworks rely on the NTIA minimum elements. And so they've all been building off of this artifact that NTIA created, and I think it was 2021, that stipulated like, this is what an SBOM must contain at a very bare minimum. And the problem is that when you dig into it, like none of the SBOM generation capabilities are actually able to achieve the NTIA minimum elements. So all of you sitting around the room are probably saying to yourself, well, like, this is dumb, let's move off of the NTIA minimum elements. If you do that, you're at the risk of creating what I call the outlet problem or the socket problem. If you've ever traveled, you know that you have to like, you know, carry around a bag of adapters because like the Japanese plugs don't match the US plugs, don't match the Northern European plugs, don't match the Australian plugs. If we don't hold the line and all agree that we're going to use the NTIA minimum elements as this kind of like de facto gold standard for what an SBOM is supposed to look like, all of a sudden you're going to end up with a European SBOM, with a FDA SBOM, which to a certain extent we already have, with a DoD specific SBOM, with a Japan specific SBOM. And so like your choices are hold the line on this like imperfect regulatory definition of an SBOM, which by the way in real life like doesn't actually get met, or abandon the NTIA minimum elements and leave yourself open to the possibility that you're going to work really hard to generate an SBOM only to find out that it lives in like region 3 of northern Scandinavia and you have to generate the region 3 SBOM. And I don't think that's a world that any of us wants to live.
Yeah, and I'll add, I like talking about that very specifically, like I just received like a data item description from the Army, and it calls out a cage code in their SBOM. No idea how to map it to an existing field. Like, we're already at that point. Like, and that's just one example. There's tons of those.
The FDA, I'm sorry, I get all excited about this, and I know you guys are like, dude, we've been here all day. The FDA, section 524B of the FD&C, which we talked about a little bit earlier, they said, hey, if you want to get a software-enabled medical device approved for distribution in the United States, you have to fork over, you know, your like massive 3-ring binder of all of your, you know, accreditation and testing and everything, and then you have to hand over an SBOM, and that SBOM has to include information on every one of those components, end of support date, and level of support. Now, they don't define what constitutes level of support, and they don't tell you where to go get information about the end of support date, and you are supposed to ask the internet and Control F and try to determine for these unsupported open source projects what constitutes level of support and end of support. And so the FDA has effectively created their own SBOM, just like DoD, the Army, has created their own SBOM. And so we want to be very careful about how far we let this genie out of the bottle, but we are going to end up with heterogeneity across industry and across geography if we're not very, very careful. On that rosy note.
All right, let's thank our speakers.
Cool, thank you.